I do think I can say without sounding too self-congratulatory, it is probably one of the very few instances in music, and for sure probably one of the few instances in opera, where serious conversations of science and national destiny, war, morality, and all the elements of opera, sex and violence, love and death, all come together on stage. And what I'm particularly pleased with this new Metropolitan Opera production for is the fact that the director, Penny Wilcock, has brought science to the fore in a way that is unmistakable. The original, very, very beautiful, but somewhat minimalist production by my longtime collaborator, Peter Sellers, had the science, but in a very sort of abstract, almost choreographic way. But here, it's unmistakable. I mean, when you come in, instead of staring at the usual Met curtain, you'll see the periodic table. Although I had to ask them to take off Einsteinium and Berkelinium because they hadn't been discovered in 1945. But you'll see and you'll get the feeling of what I feel is the romance of science. Too often we think of the arts as over here and science is over here, and we don't understand that the intellectual discovery of music and the intellectual discovery of physics and chemistry are on certain levels very similar in terms of the way play and the imagination works. And I think that that's something that is lying behind this, this very tense drama. Because on the one hand we have a war, we have a terrible moral decision at play, which is whether to use this horrific bomb on civilians. And as you know, more than 80% of the people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were civilians, not combatants. And behind that, or floating above it, the extraordinary elegance and I say even romance of scientific inquiry. So it's beautifully expressed in this opera, and I do hope you will come, not once, but twice, and maybe 3 or 4 times. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
For someone like myself that has a keen interest in mathematics and the history of physics, and a big opera fan, this symposium is truly a dream come true. Today we have the opportunity to listen and to talk with 4 very distinguished writers and scientists who know more than anyone about the history, science, and scientists of the atomic bomb: Richard Rhodes, Norman Ramsey, Edward Gershoy, and Robert Norris, and I will introduce them briefly in just a minute. It is a fascinating subject, to say the least, as much for the individuals and the stories that shaped it as for the questions it continues to provoke today. The beginning of the 20th century is often called a golden age of physics. Monumental discoveries, including the development of the theory of gravity, Einstein's exquisite general theory of relativity, and quantum physics, developed by such icons as Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Bohr, Dirac, and Born, among others, led to the period just before and during the war. Ideas almost seemed to be in the air at that time, with scientists around the world exploring new questions and taking new risks. And as we reflect on the topics to be discussed today, Leo Szilard comes to mind, one of a group of Hungarian scientists who made extraordinary contributions: von Neumann, Wigner, Teller, Polanyi, De Hevesy, and others. Szilard always seemed to be there, a touchstone for scientists and ideas worldwide. It was he who first saw the significance of nuclear fission while crossing a street in Bloomsbury, London, and the potential for enormous amounts of energy that would be released, energy that could become the basis for bombs of unthinkable power. As a young man, Szilard switched his studies from engineering to physics, moving to the University of Berlin, where the faculty included Albert Einstein, Max Planck, and Max von Laue. That was indicative of his prescient wanderings. Things were happening in post-war Berlin, things were happening in physics, and he was always there. When he fled Germany to London in 1933, he pursued nuclear chain reaction research. He could tell where things were heading. By 1938, he emigrated to the United States. It was there that he heard of the work of the physicist Lise Meitner and chemist Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. It was their momentous investigation at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry that resulted in the discovery of fission. They were the first to demonstrate how a nucleus could be pierced and split by a fast or slow neutron. And as we know, though Meitner was instrumental in that work, she was casted aside because of her being Jewish and because of having to flee Nazi Germany. So she did not get the recognition that Strassmann and Hahn received in their Nobel Prizes. This monumental piece of work is when one could say the story begins for the atomic bomb. The next question was whether one can control the reaction. Szilard had anticipated that, of course, and he realized that such a result could be used to make weapons. Scientists in many countries, Germany, Britain, Russia, Japan, Denmark, and of course the United States, were working on the same idea. But Szilard wanted the United States to take the lead in the development. He was deeply fearful that this new idea and this new technology could get into the hands of the Third Reich and have enormous devastating impact on the world order. In 1939, he drafted a letter from Albert Einstein to Franklin Delano Roosevelt warning of Germany's nuclear weapons research. The historic letter helped to initiate this country's Manhattan Project, but not until a few years later when FDR understood its full importance. Szilard also collaborated, sometimes uncomfortably, with physicist Enrico Fermi, who had left Italy and come to the United States after receiving the 1938 Nobel Prize in Physics. And famously, Fermi and his team at the University of Chicago, in a squash court under a football field, directed a series of experiments that led to the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in 1942. That same year, General Leslie Groves was selected to oversee the Manhattan Project, and he appointed Robert Oppenheimer to be the scientific director. Oppenheimer was not an obvious choice. He was a theoretical physicist, and the project was geared much more towards experiment and engineering. While he was considered among his peers as a genius, he was also thought a little arrogant and a little quirky. But Oppenheimer rose magnificently to the occasion, and in the 2 years at Los Alamos, he became a masterful manager. He had assembled some of the world's best scientists for the project. Many were from Europe, who had seen what the Nazis were doing and were worried about Germany's potential for developing a weapon. At heart, they were all lovers of science, obviously, motivated by the possibility of discovery. But as Oppenheimer learned, with big brains come big egos, and he dealt with those egos and the politics, jealousies, and tensions that came with them more than anyone would have imagined. As we know, the atomic bomb was tested at Trinity in Los Alamos, New Mexico on July 16, 1945, and dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, on August 6th and 9th, 1945. The rest, as they say, is history, a history that will always speak to and shape our present and our future. Fortunately for us, this entire history has been witnessed and written about by today's very special guests.
It's interesting that as years have moved on from 1945, the very complicated and expensive business of putting together 2 atomic bombs has shrunk in scale in most people's minds to one man, Robert Oppenheimer, one bomb, Hiroshima, and one place, Los Alamos. So what I would like to do briefly today is simply give you a sense of just how large and complicated and truly technologically difficult, not to say expensive, it was that as well, this effort was. And I hope it will give you a little bit of a sense, a greater sense of security about what is probably our main nuclear concern today, which is concern for a terrorist bomb. To see just how difficult it is, even with advances in technology since the Second World War, to make this very small amount of this very special material necessary to build a bomb. I think the official critical mass of plutonium, if it's surrounded by a heavy tamper to hold it together a little longer, is about 5 to 6 kilograms. And indeed, most modern weapons use plutonium cores of about 3 kilograms. It's a very, very dense metal, about twice as heavy as lead. So 3 kilograms is something like the size of a small orange. Uranium takes a little bit more material. The official critical mass tamped is around 15 kilograms, perhaps a grapefruit in size. So we're not talking about a lot, but it was extraordinarily difficult to tease this material out of nature. If it had not been, then presumably we would have all blown up long before in a natural way. The Manhattan Project cost about $2 billion, which translates, I believe, to maybe $30 billion today. So less than it cost for the Apollo program 20 years later. It employed, counting construction workers, about 150,000 people. And think about the fact that they managed to keep the secret, all those people, with the cooperation, of course, of the media, of what really was then just the press. Nobody, or very few people, told anyone about the secret of what they were doing. In order to make enough uranium or plutonium for the bombs, it was necessary to build vast factories. Let me start with uranium. There's a type of uranium that is an isotope of the natural form that's called U-235 because it has 235 protons and neutrons in its nucleus. It happens to be an extremely rare form of uranium, 1 part in 139, about 0.07%. And it has no chemical difference from the other forms of uranium that occur in the natural material. It has no chemical differences. They're both the same element, and elements are defined by their chemical identity. So in order to separate the one type of uranium, the type that would make a bomb, from the other materials in natural uranium, it required some sort of physical process, something that took advantage of the fact that U-235 is 3 neutrons lighter than the more predominant form of the material, which is U-238. There were theoretically any number of ways to do that, and the one that you've heard about most often today, of course, is centrifuge. Using a centrifuge, you convert the uranium to gaseous form, natural uranium, and then you spin it at very high speed inside of a tall, narrow cylinder. And because of the slight difference in mass, the materials migrate either to the inner center of the cylinder or to the outer wall. And then you can bleed off slightly enriched uranium, enriched in U-235 at one end, and slightly depleted uranium at the other end. And if you repeat this process thousands of times, you'll recall that we're concerned that the Iranians now have some 4,000 centrifuges in operation. If you repeat this process thousands of times, you increase the enrichment of the natural uranium in U-235 until you get up to the point where it's a practical amount for a bomb, which is something above 80% enrichment. And in fact, most modern bombs, the uranium is enriched above 90% U-235. That's also where the depleted uranium comes from that we often use in munitions because its density allows it to pierce armor. Convert natural uranium to a gas, uranium hexafluoride, a nasty gas which is only gaseous above 130 degrees and which is extremely corrosive of most materials. And then use some process that can distinguish slightly between the two isotopes of uranium. One process that was under development, I mentioned the centrifuge. The centrifuge technology never really got to the point during the war where we developed large-scale use of it. That came later in the development of more advanced technologies. We used some other and rather more profligate technologies, but of course they worked. One was called gaseous barrier diffusion. The idea here was that if you had a fine enough screen, think of a window screen, but with extremely fine pores, and you pressed gaseous uranium hexafluoride against the screen with high pressure, that the lighter U-235 atoms would diffuse through a little bit faster than the heavier. And then again, you could bleed off the enriched part, bleed off the depleted part, go to the next barrier tank, and the next and the next. And in fact, in order to make the levels of enrichment that we wanted, the factory that was built in one of several parallel valleys around Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the valleys forming natural barriers from one to the next in case something blew up, fundamentally, because this was all brand new technology. The factory that was built, which was called the K-25 factory, was about a half mile. It was a U-shaped building about a half mile on each side. And it was so large that the supervisors, it was largely automated, but the supervisors traveled around on bicycles inside. This huge factory was an entirely new technology, basically developed from laboratory scale, as really were all the technologies that were used during the war. And it was most of all difficult to make a satisfactory barrier, the material that would have the fine pores that would allow the gases to diffuse differently. That finally was resolved, I believe, by using something called sintered nickel powder, basically nickel powder that was pressed together, and the pores then truly were microscopic, but nickel also was able to handle the corrosive gas. And curiously and interestingly, the bearings on the pumps were a real problem because, again, of the corrosiveness of hex, as it was called. Finally, the solution was to use a brand new material that DuPont had just recently developed called Teflon. And indeed, that was one of the first industrial uses, if not the first, of this brand new plastic that was able to deal with this gas. K-25 didn't really get going till toward the end of the war. And indeed, because the first uranium bomb was profligate of critical masses, it was what's called a gun design, where a piece, in this case some rings actually, of U-235 or highly enriched uranium were fired up a cannon barrel using ordinary explosives. Rather, it was actually a Navy cannon that was about 6 feet long, into another set of target rings that were welded into the muzzle. When these pieces came together, they formed a supercritical mass, and that was the Hiroshima bomb. A very inefficient design. The most efficient way to assemble a critical mass is in a spherical form. Here you're talking about a long cylinder. Therefore, you needed more material. The geometry is important to how much material you need. And in fact, this bomb used something like 4 critical masses, about 50 kilograms or more of material. So a lot of U-235 had to be separated through these laborious processes. And it was really only at the very end of the period of work that enough material was accumulated. That's one of the reasons why the bomb was never tested at full yield, because there wasn't any more uranium to make another bomb if you blew up that one. But it was such a conservative design, it was only about 1% efficient, 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent, the Hiroshima bomb, that the designers were confident that it would indeed work, and of course it did. Another process that was used that was even more profligate was called electromagnetic separation. This was an outgrowth of work at Berkeley on the cyclotron, and in a way it was kind of a modified cyclotron. Here you gasified the uranium and then ionized it with an electric field so that it was capable of being moved by magnets, and then drew it through a curvilinear field with very large magnets on the outside, and the slightly lighter U-235 separated slightly from the slightly heavier U-238, and there were actually buckets at the end of this vacuum-contained big metal tank that caught the spatter as it came around the curve. And then in order to collect the material, which was immensely precious, especially as the enrichment got higher, the buckets had to be taken out and rinsed with acid so that the material that was spattered all over the inside was dissolved. It was such valuable material that a little speck that got on a workman's uniform would be laboriously tracked down because it was slightly radioactive, you could find it, and scraped off and saved. And indeed, from the plants and factories at Oak Ridge, the electromagnetic separation, K25 gaseous diffusion, used together to increase the enrichment. From those plants, typically once a week, once production was underway, a counterintelligence corps army man would pick up a little briefcase which had a little test tube inside of it of the week's production of this material, and take the train to Chicago, pass the briefcase to another CIC man whom he didn't know where he was going or where he'd come from, and this guy would then take the Santa Fe chief down to Los Alamos and deliver the goods. That's how laboriously this process went on. The people who worked at Oak Ridge weren't told what they were doing and were baffled by this immense amounts of material and equipment and so forth coming in at one end and nothing seemingly coming out at the other. And it was only when the war was over and they learned what they were doing. The scale, of course, speaks to the fact that the energy release in nuclear fission is absolutely enormous for the amount of material that's involved. So these big electromagnetic separation tanks, which were called Calutrons, California Utrons, were built as a kind of secondary enrichment process from the big gaseous diffusion. If you could get it up to 3 or 4% U-235, then you could go very fast through the centrifuge, through the Calutron process to get highly enriched uranium. Desperately toward the end, when the big K25 plant hadn't come online yet, another method was used, which was even more heroic, used essentially the output of electricity equivalent to a small city, where the gas was put into very thin pipes, the center of which was a pipe that had hot steam going through at 400 degrees, and around the outside of this concentric set of pipes was water at about 130 degrees, just enough to keep the gas in gaseous form. And the fact that these isotopes diffused by temperature was taken into account. And this was able to make some slightly enriched material which could then be fed to the calutrons for rapid enrichment to the top. These were the kinds of heroic efforts in machinery, filling, as I said, entire valleys of the old Tennessee parallel ridge valleys that were necessary, with all of the concomitant complexities and difficulties. with the necessity to keep in mind the fact that if you accumulated too much of this material, enriched material in one place, you could make accidentally a critical mass and blow everything up. So everything where the pipes were and how much was flowing through, all this had to be dealt with as well. It was extraordinary. And I think it speaks to the sense of great desperation that this country felt at the time, with the possibility that Nazi Germany was working in a similar way on the bomb and might have had at least 1 year's head start. At the same time, with the discovery in 1941 of plutonium, a whole new element that did not appear except in trace quantities anywhere on Earth, that was even more fissile than U-235, almost twice as much, and therefore used correspondingly less material. It was realized that since plutonium was a different element, chemically different from uranium, it would be possible, if you could make enough of this stuff, to separate it chemically, much simpler process than these huge oil refinery scale machines that were necessary to separate the various forms of uranium. When Fermi built his little, he called it a pile just because it was a pile of graphite bricks with pieces of uranium in a lattice structure inside and a control rod that was really a piece of wood with some metal stapled to it that you slid in and out. When he built this little reactor in the middle of Chicago, he was a very confident man in his physics, as you can see, with no shielding around it because it wasn't going to be run at that level. He was doing two things. He wanted to prove scientifically that there was such a thing as a chain reaction that could be sustained. As a sufficient critical mass of material would make a sustainable chain reaction. And he wanted also to see if you could make some plutonium that way. And indeed, he proved both questions to everyone's satisfaction when that pile first went critical on December 2nd, 1942. Very quickly then, everything began to be scaled up comparably, because if you run a nuclear reaction with uranium, some of the neutrons in the reaction go not into fissioning more U-235 atoms, but they go into the U-238 atoms and change it to another element, Neptunium-239. Is that right? Yes? Okay, these are the physicists. I'm not. Which very quickly, in 2 or 3 days, decays to plutonium-239. And plutonium-239 was the material that was needed for the bombs. There are other forms, isotopes of plutonium. They were undesirable because they spontaneously fissioned and could cause the bomb to pre-detonate by starting a chain reaction before the whole thing was in its perfect form. So it turns out then that you can use what is actually a waste material in a reactor, the U-238, to make another fissile material, U-239. And therefore, once Fermi had proved that the reactor would actually work and be controllable, very quickly a similar but larger reactor, that is to say air-cooled, moderated with graphite, with uranium slugs in it as its fuel, was built in Oak Ridge, where at first General Groves felt he would probably put the whole thing, not only the uranium operation, but also the plutonium operation. They built a big air-cooled pile in Oak Ridge and began making little bits of plutonium which could be sent to Los Alamos for research on the properties of this very strange material. At the same time, Groves quickly realized he needed to put his plutonium operation somewhere else. And where else was, as it turned out, on the big bend of the Columbia River in eastern Washington, where the proximity to Grand Coulee and the other big hydroelectric facilities farther up the river made it possible to have a generous supply of electricity, which was needed to run all of this equipment. So by 43 and 44, large production-scale nuclear reactors, never before seen on Earth, that were cooled with water from the river, purified water from the Columbia, graphite moderated, big blocks of very high purity graphite, and with channels drilled through into which little slugs of uranium, which were coated with aluminum to make them less corroded by the water that was flowing through to cool them, could be put into these channels, pushed in with a rod, left in for 100 days of operation, which would breed about 1 part in 4,000 plutonium, and then pushed with the rod out the back end where they dropped. They're now highly radioactive. They dropped into a very deep pool of pure water, and they were left there for 60 days so that some of the fission products that were highly radioactive could decay away, so they wouldn't be quite so hot. At which point they were remotely dumped into casks, moved on a railroad line over to, and this was the really heroic part of this operation, these huge concrete buildings with 8-foot thick walls that were about 800 feet long, 60 feet high, 80 feet wide. They were so large, standing there on that desert plain next to the river, that they called them Queen Mary's, because they looked like that famous ocean liner of the day. Inside were a series of concrete cells, tanks, where the various processes necessary to take these slugs of uranium now enriched in plutonium, dissolve them with nitric acid, blow the dissolved solution through to the next tank, mix that with chemicals that would precipitate out various materials in the solution, blow that on through to another precipitation stage, finally ending up with a solution that was basically pure plutonium nitrate. And that material, which again was a very small amount of material, was put into a metal container, sealed in a wooden box, not particularly radioactive, because plutonium, believe it or not, is not particularly radioactive. You can hold a piece in your hand and it really won't hurt you at all, despite what you've heard. This was put into an Army ambulance, driven from Hanford, Washington, down to Salt Lake City, transferred to another Army ambulance, and again, the two drivers didn't know where the other one came from for the secrecy aspect, driven then down to Los Alamos. There was an unfortunate discovery along the way. I think I better stop soon here. That was that you couldn't make a gun bomb using plutonium. If you tried to, it was so reactive that if you blew a piece up a barrel at 3,000 feet per second, the piece would melt down before it reached the muzzle and united with the rest. Therefore, Los Alamos had to transform itself and invent a whole new technology for making a critical mass. That was the famous implosion system, the bomb that you will see on stage, I think, certainly we did in San Francisco during the opera, where high explosives shaped charges were used to squeeze a mass of plutonium to greater density, thus making it supercritical and thus blowing up. For that, in the spring of '45, the Hanford Engineering Works shipped 5 kilograms of plutonium to Los Alamos, and that was the bomb that was tested at Trinity. And then 5 more kilograms in July, and that was the bomb that was used on Nagasaki. And then 5 more kilograms at the end of July, which would have been another bomb for use against the Japanese. This heroic effort, and heroic in the classic sense of the word, heroic in scale, heroic in pressure to accomplish, not to make mistakes, was necessary before those first bombs could be completed. And I think if you keep that in mind, it should be a cause of some comfort, as I said before. But it should also, I think, leave you with some sense of just what desperation we felt about these new and obviously decisive weapons of war. All that followed from that was colored to some degree by just the sheer scale. To take finally one comparison that was offered by the French nuclear scientist Bertrand Goldschmidt in a memoir about his experiences during the war with this program. He said, from a laboratory bench in 1939, the Manhattan Project expanded in scale until by the end of the war, it was comparable in scale of investment and number of employees to the United States automobile industry in 1945. That's what a huge effort it was. Thank you.
Act 1 of the opera we will see on Monday takes place at Los Alamos, New Mexico in the weeks leading up to the test. Act 2 takes place at the Trinity test site, some 200 miles to the south, the night of July 15th, 16th, concluding with the test at 5:30 a.m. that ushered in the atomic age. Tension, apprehension, and swirling emotions surround what is about to happen. Will the device work? Will the weather cooperate? Or might the test have to be postponed? If it does work, then is its use on a Japanese city the right thing to do, or are there alternatives? Should scientists who created this new weapon of war have any say in how politically or militarily it is used? How did they get to Trinity? What had gone on in the previous 3 years, or approximately 1,000 days, to have the bomb ready to test and soon after ready to use? Let me briefly step back and recount the story of the Manhattan Project. And I will do so largely from the perspective of the man who headed the project, General Leslie Richard Groves, drawing upon my biography of him entitled Racing for the Bomb. The story begins in December 1938 and January 1939, when scientists discovered that fission can take place in a certain element, namely uranium, and that it might be possible to make an extremely large explosive out of an extremely small quantity of material. Over the next 2.5 years, research went on mainly at the laboratory level in the United States and elsewhere, until Franklin Roosevelt, urged by his science advisor, a man named Vannevar Bush, decided to undertake an all-out crash program to develop an atomic bomb. In June 1942, a colonel from the Army Corps of Engineers was given the job, but he did not move fast enough for Bush, and he urged the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, to find a replacement to get things going more quickly. On September 17, 1942, then Colonel Leslie Groves, also from the Corps of Engineers, was selected, and the project immediately went into overdrive and would not let up for the next 1,000 days. As Groves is one of the main figures in the opera, let me take a minute to introduce him to you. He was born in 1896 in Albany, New York, the third son of an Army chaplain. Like many children of career military, Dick, as he was known, grew up on Army posts, moving from station to station as his father was assigned various duties. The family gave educational excellence the highest priority and promoted competition within a strong moral environment of right and wrong, of duty and service to God and country. His college education included a year at the University of Washington and 2 years at MIT before entering West Point. His class was accelerated to meet the need for officers during World War I, and thus he graduated on November 1st, 1918, just 10 days before the end of the war. He ranked 4th in his class and chose as his branch the Corps of Engineers. West Point was founded in 1802 as an engineering school by Thomas Jefferson, and for most of the 19th century and part of the 20th, it was the top engineering school in the nation. Throughout the interwar period, Groves oversaw ever larger engineering projects. He married, had 2 children, and studied at the Army's advanced schools, the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth and the Army War College in Washington, D.C., and slowly advanced in rank. As the nation mobilized for war beginning in 1940, Groves supervised hundreds of domestic Army construction projects. These included the building of camps, depots, air bases, munitions plants, hospitals, airplane factories, and the Pentagon, all to accommodate an army that would grow from 135,000 in the 1930s to over 8 million during World War II. Groves's construction budget was $8 billion, 4 times that of the Manhattan Project, and he oversaw a workforce of 1 million men at the peak. Upon being selected for his new assignment, he had just turned 46 years of age. To be chosen to head the Manhattan Project was not a feather in his cap. There was much uncertainty about whether it could be done, or done in time to make a difference in the war. Groves had wanted to go to Europe, to be a combat engineer and fight the Germans. It was not to be. And so, after a moment or two of regret, on that September morning, He set about to do his utmost to see if it could be done. If all the smart scientists, many Nobel Prize winners among them, Vannevar Bush and other high officials, and even President Roosevelt himself, thought the effort worthwhile, then he would give it his all. In the fall of 1942, he quickly visited the university campuses where the laboratory work was being conducted: Columbia, the University of Chicago, and the University of California, Berkeley. At Berkeley, he met Robert Oppenheimer and saw immediately that he might be the person to head up the special scientific laboratory. He next chose the main sites where the huge facilities would be built that would produce the explosive material for the bomb, the highly enriched uranium and plutonium. He settled on what would become Oak Ridge, Tennessee, then chose an isolated spot on a New Mexican mesa that would become Los Alamos, and the third site, a piece of land in southeast Washington state, half the size of Rhode Island, would become Hanford, where the reactors that would produce the plutonium would be built. Simultaneously, he recruited some of the biggest corporations in America to design, build, and operate his atomic factories: DuPont, General Electric, Westinghouse, Stone & Webster, J.A. Jones, Union Carbide, Tennessee Eastman, Chrysler, Monsanto, among dozens of others. Groves was familiar with many of the executives, scientists, and engineers at these companies, having worked with them during the Army mobilization construction phase. He was now determined to have them work for him. And if General Groves walked into your office and wanted something, it was virtually impossible to say no. Groves had a lot going for him. Nothing less than the full resources of the U.S. government were available. A West Point classmate later observed, quote, "Groves was given as much power in that position as any officer ever has had," close quote. That's an extraordinary statement. He had an open checkbook on the U.S. Treasury and the ability to recruit virtually anyone in the United States that might have a special expertise that was needed. He was a bureaucratic warrior of the first rank in the corridors of Washington. He knew how to play the game to his advantage and deal with competing government agencies and departments to get what he wanted. Illustrative of this skill is a meeting with Donald Nelson, one of the most powerful figures in Washington, who, as head of the War Production Board, assigned priorities for scarce materials and resources. Less than 48 hours after being given the job, still Colonel Groves marched into Nelson's office and demanded the highest priority rating for his project. Groves knew from his 2 years of grappling with Army construction projects that priority ratings can make all the difference. Groves arrived with a letter in hand to himself, lacking only Nelson's signature. The letter said that he, Nelson, was in full accord to grant a AAA rating or any lesser rating to whatever Groves requested. Nelson, never having laid eyes on this brusque colonel before and not knowing anything about the bomb project, initially refused. Groves then applied the pressure. He got up and prepared to leave and said to Nelson as he was halfway out the door that he would recommend to the Secretary of War that the project be abandoned, since Mr. Nelson refused to carry out the wishes of the president. Nelson called him back and signed a letter, and Groves used it repeatedly to get the resources he needed for the Manhattan Project. Groves was also an extraordinary judge of character and chose his subordinates wisely, sometimes in the face of opposition. Oppenheimer is the best example. On the surface, Oppenheimer appeared not to have the requisite skills of experience needed to head the scientific laboratory. He was a theoretical physicist, where an experimental physicist would have been more obvious. He had never administered anything. One of his colleagues said that he could not manage a hamburger stand. His past looked politically suspect and unsuitable for this most secretive of positions. His wife, brother and sister-in-law were communists, and he had consorted with leftist causes. Nevertheless, against the advice of almost everyone, Groves chose him, and as we know, Oppenheimer became a brilliant leader. The Groves we observed during these 1,000 days going about his daily schedule is a master organizer, trying to control every aspect of the project. so that it might help end a horrible war. He said he was never out to win a popularity contest, and he cared little of what others thought of him. He had a job to do, a high-priority project supported by the President, Secretary of War, and Army Chief of Staff. He stepped on a lot of toes, was gruff and blunt and impatient with others if they were not doing their job. All of his effort and the efforts of tens of thousands of others were coming to a climax in the New Mexico desert. John Adams and Peter Sellers have correctly captured one of Groves's essential attributes when we first meet him in Act 1, his drive and determination to control events. We see Groves wanting to control the blustery, rainy weather that might delay the test, but of course unable to do so, and frustrated with the meteorologist, Hubbard, who cannot provide an accurate forecast. How long will the rain last? Will the skies clear? He is also told by the Army doctor, Captain Nolan, that radioactivity may be a problem and that the pressure is getting to some of the scientists. Control is at the very center of the story of the atom. Early in their investigations, some scientists raised the question of whether detonating an atomic bomb might cause an uncontrolled chain reaction, igniting the atmosphere and ending life on Earth. Several scientists were put to work calculating the likelihood of this occurring, and they concluded that it would not happen, though they said in a report that, quote, further work on the subject is highly desirable. That's true. As this example shows, with many others that would follow, when tampering with the atom, the stakes are high. Well before the day of Trinity, men were thinking of how to control the military and civilian atom after the war. How would it influence international politics? When might the Soviet Union develop a bomb? The methods and techniques of control have had some success. For almost 50 years, there was an intense arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, tempered somewhat by arms control treaties and measures such as the hotline, whose purpose was to prevent things from spinning out of control in times of crisis. While we made it through that scary chapter of the atomic story by the skin of our teeth, we now face the problem of how to control others who want the bomb, like Iran or North Korea. The answers of how to do that are not clear, nor are the consequences that might ensue. That morning at Trinity, which is the climax of the opera we are about to see, began our experience of learning how to live with the bomb. 68 years later, it's still a work in progress. Thank you.
If you could take us back to the summer of 1945, where Truman is now President of the United States and has this very weighty decision about whether to use this new weapon in Japan. The record of that debate among his very close advisors is somewhat murky and I think somewhat misunderstood. Could you bring us back to that time and talk a little about what your experiences through research and so forth started off at least?
I think there are two places to look when we ask ourselves how this decision was made. And of course, it's been a subject of controversy. I would say is even a greater subject of controversy today than it was, let's say, in 1946, because students really have not perhaps been able to or been encouraged to place themselves back in that time. One of the locuses that I'm thinking of is a committee that was put together by Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, called the Interim Committee, tasked with the work of trying to think about where to go from here with this weapon. Interim because between the war and the Congress, which when it eventually met again after the war, would of course have to take responsibility legislatively for dealing with this new technology and industry and challenge and so forth. On that committee was Robert Oppenheimer, representing the scientific community, I think, a representative from the Navy, the man who was just about to become Harry Truman's Secretary of State, Southern politician, canny, wily guy named Jimmy Burns, a number of others as well within the Manhattan Project and within the military. They chewed over this question more during their lunch break at one particular meeting than during the formal time of the meeting, of whether or not there was anything short of using the weapons by surprise that would be equally effective. And that's really an important qualifier. When, for example, Oppenheimer was sent with Fermi and two other Manhattan Project leaders to give a purely scientific assessment of the same question as he was after this meeting I'm talking about. The question was, can you think of anything that would do the job without actually exploding these weapons over Japanese cities that would be equally likely to end the war? And their response, Fermi was another member of the committee, and who was head of the Met Lab?
Compton.
Yes, Compton, the scientist who ran one of the major laboratories. None of them could say, no, demonstrating this weapon isn't going to guarantee an end to the war. Blowing it up in Tokyo Harbor as another way of demonstrating it isn't going to end the war. Threatening with it but not using it isn't going to end the war. They were not able to find the answer to that question as it was presented to them, nor really was the informal discussion at the interim committee, although they talked about questions like a demonstration, or perhaps warning the Japanese where the bomb would be used. Burns at that point said, well, if you do that, they're just going to move prisoners of war into that city. And put more of our people at risk. And let's not forget that there were some 30,000 Allied prisoners of war in Japan at that time. And there had been a Japanese custom of moving prisoners of war into danger zones as a way of using them as hostages. And in addition, there was a Japanese custom when territory had to be surrendered to kill any prisoners of war that were in that territory rather than move them during a retreat. So one of the things that happened as a result of using these bombs to help end the war was there was a great deal of gratitude from prisoners of war in Japan. They felt that these weapons had saved their lives. So let me just then add, the other locus of interest and the other locus that I think people forget today is that the decision to bomb cities under whatever pretense that we were really just extending the bombing of factories into the neighborhoods where the factory workers lived was not a decision that had been made about the atomic bombs in 1945. It had, of course, been made in Europe during the strategic bombing programs there. And in particular, the use of firebomb techniques had completely burned out Hamburg with great loss of life, and famously Dresden with a loss of at least 100,000, perhaps more lives in one night's bombing. Then, in order to slow down the Japanese, we had begun firebombing the Japanese cities, such that by the end of the Second World War, all Japanese cities of more than 50,000 population had essentially been burned out. And on the first great firebombing campaign of that last few months of the war, 18 square miles of downtown Tokyo had been destroyed, with the loss of life conservatively estimated at 140,000, more than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It's important not only in terms of the decision that was made, but also in terms of our comprehension of what these weapons were after the war, that they were not seen at the time as different in kind, different qualitatively from the weapons we were already using. They were simply more efficient. And they were indeed deliberately set off at a high altitude over the Japanese cities so that the effect would primarily be one of blast and fire and minimally of radiation, because radiation was in the same general category in the minds of the scientists at Los Alamos and the Target Committee as poison gas. So when Philip Morrison, one of the men who worked with Dr. Ramsey after the war, during the war and after the war, on Tinian, when he went into Japan very shortly after the end of the war, in September 1945, he wrote that he flew over Tokyo and all he could see was gray ash and broken gray roof tiles. And then they flew down the green length of that beautiful archipelago to Hiroshima, and all he could see was gray ash and broken gray roof tiles. There was, in other words, no sense of a significant difference. And that also was important to this decision. I'll defer to Dr. Ramsey.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make a remark that there's an excellent article written at about that time by Secretary of War Stimson on the decision to either make or drop the atomic bomb, which essentially it says he had the decision.
Yes.
It was recommended to the president, but nevertheless, it's a very thoughtful discussion of the reasons. I recommend it, since he did make the decision. I recommend that as a source of information.
It was published in Harper's, I think, in 1947. And
Yes.
I'm sure you can find it these days online. Let me just add, the latest scholarship by a Japanese scholar who teaches at the University of California, Santa Barbara, in a book called, I believe, Racing to the End, a similar title to Stan Norris's title, looked very carefully at the documentation from the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union. And I think establishes pretty authoritatively that the fundamental reason the Japanese were prepared to surrender when they were was the Soviet entry into the war. They had hoped that the Soviet Union, which had been neutral against Japan up to that time, would somehow broker a deal that would allow them to be able to arrange something less than unconditional surrender. When the Soviet Union entered the war, which Stalin did as soon as he had heard about Hiroshima, because he wanted to pick off as much of Japan as he could for the Soviet sphere of influence. Japan would have ended up, if the war had not ended when it did, probably divided the way Germany ended up divided. He jumped into the war. They advanced very rapidly across Manchuria, took over the Kuriles, which Russia still controls, were moving down toward Hokkaido. And indeed, some of our final conventional bombing efforts were made on August 14th, the last day before the official surrender, to scare the Soviets away from Hokkaido. We bombed heavily in northern Japan at the very last days of the war. There was actually fighting going on between the Japanese and the Soviet Union, it turns out, all the way till August 29th, until, in other words, the official surrender on August 30th. The official signing of the documents. So this book, which I recommend to you, is as close, I think, to an authoritative look at it all. And it makes clear that the one function of the atomic bombs, really, was to give the emperor a reason to step into the political world, which emperors normally did not do, in order to save the imperial household and the imperial family and say, we've got to end this war. And indeed, in the final document, the statement that the emperor issued to his people, asking them to lay down their arms, he cites, quote, a new and most terrible weapon that has led us to have to think the unthinkable. So the atomic bombs served their function, but they were not decisive about ending the war, according to the scholarship that I've seen.
I just wanted to say, again, in illuminating Oppenheimer and his relationship to all this, before the bomb was dropped, there was a petition circulated in Chicago by James Franck and Leo Szilard, whose name you heard of before, opposing the use of the bomb. And that petition was supposed to be circulated in Los Alamos as well. And my understanding is that Oppenheimer objected and prevented that petition from being circulated. And whether or not it was a correct decision to drop the bomb, I don't think it's to Oppenheimer's credit that he prevented people there from trying to put some input in that.
Yeah, this question about the decision to drop the bomb has generated an enormous literature. And my take on it, which I talk about in the book, is that using the word decision really doesn't do justice to what happened here. This wasn't a decision like people sit down around a table and hash out things back and forth, the pros and cons. The momentum of this thing was extraordinary. This was a runaway train. Groves is the locomotive driver here, and as he says, as far as I was concerned, Truman's decision was one of non-interference, basically a decision not to upset existing plans. Remember, he became president on Roosevelt's death on April 12th. He didn't even know about the bomb, and suddenly this is thrust upon him. He's got advisors like Henry Stimson and George Marshall. It would have taken an enormous good reason for him to stop what was already overwhelming momentum from every part of the Manhattan Project, which was aiming to use this weapon by July. So to even discuss this as some sort of thing that was weighed back and forth the decision to use it was made when the decision was taken by Roosevelt to make it, I think. It was a weapon of war. It was seen as something that might influence the end of the war, and it did. And just to take these enormously crucial dates here, August 6th, August 8th, and August 9th. 6th is Hiroshima, 8th, the Soviet Union enters the war, the 9th, Nagasaki takes place, and then there's beginning to hear about possible surrender. You can imagine doing some sort of counterfactual history what the world would have been like had the bomb not been ready in August, and that was certainly possible. With the Russians entering the war, Japan would have turned into something resembling Germany here in terms of dual occupation and so on. So all of those days are quite crucial for both ending the war and the beginning of the Cold War. But thank you.
Norman, you were asked by Oppenheimer to head the effort for developing an efficient delivery system for the bomb, both for Nagasaki and for Hiroshima. What were some of the very real challenges that you had in your group to deal with that very complex problem?
Well, we had a combination of things. Namely, at the time we were asked to do that, there wasn't an airplane that could carry a bomb, and there wasn't the means of doing it, so that had to be developed. And then there was the process of indeed deciding how it should be done. And I mean, the problem it did involve also worry as to whether you could effectively have a demonstration. Unfortunately, the characteristic of a nuclear explosion is that it doesn't make a very good demonstration in the absence of killing lots of people. Namely, if you can find it, a woodsy area that has not much other than trees there, it doesn't look like much of a bomb because they don't knock down what is a various one of the things that makes the nuclear bomb so effective is that it's well matched to the frequencies characteristic of housing. In other words, it gives just the right push and shove to bring down houses to a large extent over a big area, or buildings of any kind, houses. And it's not very good for bringing down trees in the unoccupied woods or places where there aren't people around.
I don't want to monopolize. I have a whole bunch of other questions, but I'd like to give the audience an opportunity. If you could just identify yourself and your question. I don't know if there's a mic set up, Brian? Okay.
Yeah, my name is Peter Koch. I'm a professor at Stony Brook. President Truman, as I've read and it was commented, apparently did not know anything about the Manhattan Project, but he had been a military officer, and I believe in the Army, and had seen action as an artillery officer in World War I, so he was certainly aware of weapons that could cause significant damage. And to what extent did that inform his decision to go along with what was recommended to him, since this was a military decision?
Did you say Truman?
Truman, I believe, was an artillery officer in World War I.
Yeah, he was. I don't think it had any role at all. I mean, My take on Truman is that he's not the top of the pyramid here. He's in the stream that's moving so fast, and he just goes along with it. To do otherwise, he didn't have any other reasons to go in any other direction. So the whole sweep of things, so much so that the orders to use these bombs, actually written by Groves, and given to Tinian, to use the bombs as made ready. Now, they were pre-delegated. That is, you keep using them until you're told otherwise. And after the second one, Truman interjected himself back into the command chain and said, let's wait, let's stop. So, I mean, even in terms of the command and control of these nuclear weapons, he had basically, whether he knew it or not, it sort of separated himself out. Now, that doesn't mean that Groves and the other military figures, Curtis LeMay and the rest of them, sort of seized control, but things were moving in all of that direction, and the bombs were used until Truman told them to stop using them. There was a third one on the way, and a fourth one.
And indeed, I saw a memo between Groves and Oppenheimer speculating that by October, by using a mixed core of uranium and plutonium, they would be able to deliver up to 6 bombs a month. So there's not much question that it was a good idea that the Japanese surrendered when they did. Let me say something about President Truman, and I feel I can say this because I grew up in Independence, Missouri, and I used to see the president come out of his summer White House. My church was half a block away. He'd come out and let some tourists take their picture with him and go back inside. Truman was a self-educated man and deeply educated in that sense. People would say in Congress that they'd never check a book out at the Library of Congress without finding Harry's name on the checkout list in the back. On the other hand, he was also a very intellectually secure man. He wasn't quite as serene a fellow as I think David McCullough portrays him in his biography. In fact, one of the reviews of David's biography was titled Harry of Sunnybrook Farm. The fact is, Truman was not, for a long time in his presidency, rather, I think, like the present occupant of the White House, very confident in himself. And the fact that these leaders whom he greatly admired were prepared to vouch for this project undoubtedly was central to his willingness to go along with it. Where he changed, that intervention that he made, came as a result of his learning that these weapons had killed tens of thousands of non-combatants. And indeed, there's a famous note from one of the cabinet members at a meeting right after, I guess after Hiroshima, no, it must have been after Nagasaki, where he quotes Truman as saying, "We're not going to use this again because I don't want to kill all those kids." So it was that decision, which he reiterated later in his presidency as a reason why he would never use these weapons again, that I think was central to his coming to understanding of exactly what it was he had agreed to authorize.
Question?
Yes, my name is Galen Remington. I'm a pioneer of pre-negotiation for international and intranational disputes. I'm interested in more information you might have about the exchange that occurred between the U.S. leaders and Japan after the first bomb, because very often there isn't a use of force to persuade because there isn't a way to try to get a dialogue going about the fact that we will do it again, and do they understand, explaining what this bomb is, because they probably couldn't understand the radioactivity, it wasn't known. Was there exchange that you all are familiar with, some of the details of what was said by the Japanese? One more thing, I knew a Japanese man who I argued with in college. He was the head of Tektronix at the time, and he said that the Japanese would never, ever have surrendered without both bombs.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Anybody?
Well, I'll take it, yeah. Well, in terms of the communication with the Japanese, of course, Truman did issue a very, very strong proclamation on, I think it was July 25th, where he said a rain of ruin would come down on Japan. Now, Japan didn't know what was around the corner, but that was a demand for unconditional surrender. Interestingly enough, I believe it was Phil Morrison, Dick, who...
Morrison, Louis Alvarez.
And Louis Alvarez dropped on Japan a canister.
The first bomb, since it had never been tested, was accompanied by a parachuted system that measured the blast using microphones and so forth. For the second bomb, must have been, well, I'm not sure which bomb. I guess it must have been Hiroshima, because in the Hiroshima Peace Museum, they show the bomb with a parachute, which it didn't have. So they must have been thinking of the canisters. They put a message in the canister, is the point, to a scientist who had done his PhD work at Berkeley, who was known to be a Japanese scientific leader. And the message was eventually delivered to him. I think more to the point, after the Hiroshima bomb was exploded, the Air Force decided it needed to warn the Japanese people. It was concerned that the destruction was so complete the message might not get to Tokyo. And more than 1 million leaflets saying, inquire of your friends at Hiroshima what happened there. In other words, an appeal to the people was distributed over large areas of cities all over Japan. Unfortunately, the time it took to get these things made and loaded into bombs and dropped by planes, they weren't dropped until after August 9th.
Is that to say there was no dialogue at all, no effort by U.S. leaders to talk to Japanese leaders before the second bomb?
No, the effort had been made before the bombs were dropped.
No, I mean between the two bombs.
No.
So that the first one would have been effective.
No, as Stan said, the bombs were released by the president rather the way you would release a new kind of artillery shell. Once they were released to the military, they were to use them as they felt appropriate until such a time as he stopped them from doing so.
And as far as the Japanese steeling themselves for an American invasion, which was planned for November, which would have been multiple D-Day size force, the Japanese military were ready for that fight and wanted to bloody the Americans and thought they could get a better surrender terms. Now, that was a lot of tension in the upper reaches of there. Some wanted not to do that. Some wanted to go ahead, even after the atomic bomb. And it was finally, as Dick said, the entry of the emperor, who rarely did such things, but finally put his foot down and said, this has to stop, and the war was over. Of course, we were listening to all of this, too, because we had cracked the Japanese codes, and we knew things were going on. So after the second bomb, it sounded as though things were going in the direction of ending the war.
But I would just...
Even then, there was, even after the second bomb, there was a bit of an interruption, because there was some worry whether they could enforce the resignation or the giving up.
Right.
The attempt that most of you have heard of by the Japanese government to work through the Soviet government, still neutral, to get some kind of better surrender terms was in fact blocked by Stalin deliberately. He kept giving the Japanese requests that they translate the document into Russian or whatever, just to slow them down so that he could get his forces moving. So there was their hope, which was to work through the Soviets, was deliberately stalled by the Soviets. And interestingly, even the day before the Imperial Rescript, which was made as a recording on a recording disc, was prepared, there was a small faction of young army officers who had access to the emperor's palace in Tokyo, who were running around the building trying to find that recording to destroy it. They didn't want this to happen. There was a very clear effort on the part of some of the Japanese military to continue fighting to the point where the Americans were prepared to give them better terms.
Regrettably, this very spirited discussion must come to a close. Richard Rhodes has graciously agreed to sign books for those of you who have requested his signature. Thank you, Richard Rhodes. Thank you, Professor Ramsey. Thank you, Professor Gerjoy and Dr. Norris. Do you want to have your book signed too?
If anyone has them to hear, I'll be glad to sign them, yeah.
You're going to have them out in
Yes.
Or maybe they're
And
at-
thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, sure.